In this video, I'll be showing you how to create a planet from scratch. So let's roll the intro and get straight into it. Open Photoshop and create a landscape canvas. Then I turned the canvas black cause space and all that. After that, I imported some textures that I had downloaded from unsplash.com. And all the links to the images that I'll be using today are in the description if you want to follow along. Pick one of the textures as your base texture. Here I picked this concrete texture to serve that purpose. Then use the circular selection tool and draw a perfect circle by pressing on shift while dragging. And once you're happy with the selection, go to filter, distort and click on spherize. Or is it spherize? This option right here. Then move the slider to 100 and press OK. I made a copy of this layer just in case if I mess it up, which I probably might. Then add the white texture on top of the base layer and clip it to the base layer. Change the blend mode to overlay or soft light. Here I picked overlay. Then repeat the same process using a different texture. I use this blue watercolor like texture, or at least that's what I think it is. And this time, instead of using overlay, I use soft light as the blending mode. You could also use overlay if you want to. Then I did the same process for the third texture and the fourth texture, which were also the same textures. And for both of them, I use soft light as the blending mode. And make sure you clip all these textures to the base layer. And since we use spherize on the base layer, apply them to the textures as well. This is not absolutely necessary, and as you can see, I left one of the effect invisible on the first texture. It's all about personal preference. And once you're happy with the texture, now it's time to add shadows and highlights. At first we'll add shadows. And for that, add a layer right below the base layer. And by holding on Ctrl or Command, click on the layer mask of the base layer to load the circular selection. And in this new layer, fill the selection with black. Before we start creating shadows, we want to copy the base layer onto a new layer, but without the layer mask. And once you have done that, add a layer mask to this new layer, and now it's time to create the shadows. Reduce the flow of the brush to less than 10% and using black as the foreground color, start masking the region on the right like so. Take your time with this process and use references if you want to. I think I'm happy with this, but I'll definitely come back to this later. For now, let's move on and add a halo and highlights. Add a layer right below the base layer. Then use the color picker tool to pick a shade of the color of the planet. In this case, I chose a shade of blue. Now once again, make a circular selection of the planet and using the color you picked as the foreground color, fill this selection. It'll look something like this. But this process would be much easier if this layer was below the black circle. So I move this layer to the bottom. Now convert this layer into a smart object and go to filter, then to blur and apply a Gaussian blur with a value of around 130. The glow looks alright, but we don't want it to be there in the shadow of the planet. So to mask it, add a layer mask to this layer and using a soft brush with a low flow, erase it carefully. Now add a layer on top of all the layers and clip it to the base layer. Using a soft brush with a flow of 10% or less, paint over the left side of the planet using white as the foreground color. And just like the shadows, take your time with this process. And once you're done, add a layer on top and using the gradient tool, add a gradient across the screen. I used two similar shades of blue since it complements the colors on the planet. You can always use a gradient according to the textures you chose. Now turn the layer blend mode to soft light so that the gradient only affects the planet. To enhance the colors a bit more, add a second gradient on top and change the blend mode to soft light. And because the colors became a bit too vibrant, I reduced the opacity of this gradient to 12%. At this point, I thought I'd add a second halo just to enhance the outline of the planet. So add a layer at the bottom and make a selection of the planet. After that, fill in this circle using a shade that matches that of the planet. And in this case, I used the shade of blue. Convert this into a smart object and then go to filter, then to blur, and apply a Gaussian blur with a value near to 65. Then, like we did before, erase the halo from the shadow side of the planet. Now add a layer below the highlights layer and clip it to the base layer. And using black as the foreground color, paint in some extra shadows if necessary. If you add a little too much, be sure to mask it out using a layer mask. If the halo is still visible in the shadows, make sure to remove it using a soft brush with a minimum flow. This is when I grouped the textures together. It took me long enough. Anyway, moving on from that, I've added more highlights and shadows on different layers and clipped them to the main layer. Now add a black and white layer on top of all the layers in order to check if the brightness across the planet makes sense. And now it's time for some special effects. Add this stock image below the gradient layers and change its blend mode to screen. Now using the warp tool, align the rim light in a way that it aligns with the planet that we have just created. And once you're happy with the adjustments, add a layer mask and erase everything except the blue rim light. Now add the second image and change the blend mode to screen. Add a hue saturation adjustment layer and then clip it to the image. Now move the hue slider around until you find a color that matches the color of the planet. Now add a layer mask and erase the unnecessary parts like I did previously. And using the warp tool, make adjustments until you are satisfied with the position. And now it's time to clean up the image. If you zoom right in, you might see some imperfections and misalignments. This black outline that you see here isn't supposed to show like this, and it's from the black circle under the main layer. So in order to align it with the main layer, I transformed it by reducing its size by 0.2%. And finally, on top of everything, I drew a gradient across the planet and reduced the opacity of this layer to around 7%. And once you add the gradient, you might see more noise in the halos. So take your own time and erase the unnecessary parts using layer masks. At this point, we are pretty much done, and if you want to make any small changes, you can do that now. The really cool thing about this planet is that you can use this as a preset if you want to. Now let me show you what I'm talking about. You can delete or add the clip textures and it will create a different kind of planet every single time. And you can also try different blending modes to create the planet you desire. I used an exposure layer below the final gradient layer to make the shadows even darker. In the end, I ended up adding a bit more shadows over here to make the planet more realistic. And now we are finally done. If you found this tutorial useful, leave a like and comment, and also consider subscribing. And I'll be back with another video next week.